There we go. Didn't come on right away. Good morning. It is Friday and it is time for reading Little House on the Prairie. So we're going to start off with this part of our reading lesson first. You will also have a second reading lesson that you'll need to click on and do today because we're going to start some close reading activities to keep up our nonfiction skills. So there'll be two readings for Friday. And then probably a couple closed readings each week after that. So we are going to be doing chapters 15 and 16 in our trifold. And our word for today is quinine, an interesting word that you may have actually heard with this coronavirus in the news. And we're going to talk about that in our chapter Fever and Ague. Now they actually have two chapters here, which I'm not really sure why. I've never understood why it's grouped that way in our reading materials because they're about two totally different things. And to be honest, one of them's a little on the long side, so we've got a lot of reading to do today. We're going to hear about fever and ague and about people being sick, and then about a fire in the chimney. And we'll talk more about that when we get to it. We're going to be working on analyzing setting today in our trifold, analyzing setting. So we're looking for when the story takes place and where the story takes place. And then we're going to write at the bottom about how the setting impacts the plot. And could the story take place in present day? Why or why not? Which kind of gives away, a whole lot of things about it. But we've already talked about the setting extensively at the beginning and the pre-lesson. So we're just going to be writing down notes about things we've already learned about. So we're looking for quinine. It's going to come in the first chapter. Fever and Ague, which starts on, there we go, page 182. Page 182, Fever and Ague. And we'll read through both chapters before we come back and do any activities. Now blackberries were ripe, so we're in the late summer into August for sure. Not September, but in August. And in the hot afternoons, Laura went with Ma to pick them. The big black juicy berries hung thick in briar patches in the creek bottoms. Some were in the shade of trees and some were in the sun. But the sun was so hot that Laura and Ma, stayed in the shade. There were plenty of berries. Deer lay in the shady groves and watched Ma and Laura. Blue jays flew at their sunbonnets and scolded because they were taking the berries. Snakes hurriedly crawled away from them, and in the trees the squirrels woke up and chattered at them. Wherever they went among the scratchy briars, mosquitoes rose up in buzzing swarms. Mosquitoes were thick on the big ripe berries, sucking the sweet juice. But they liked to bite Laura and Ma as much as they liked to eat blackberries. Laura's fingers and her mouth were purple-black with berry juice. Her face and her hands and her bare feet were covered with briar scratches and mosquito bites. And they were spattered with purple stains, too, where she had slapped at the mosquitoes. But every day they brought home pails full of berries, and Ma spread them in the sun to dry. Every day they ate all the blackberries they wanted, and the next winter they would have dried blackberries to stew. Mary hardly ever went to pick blackberries. She stayed in the house to mind baby Carrie, because she was older. In the daytime, there were only one or two mosquitoes in the house. But at night, if the wind wasn't blowing hard, mosquitoes came in thick swarms. On still nights, Pa kept piles of damp grass burning all around the house and stable. The damp grass made a smudge of smoke to keep the mosquitoes away. But a good many mosquitoes came anyway. Pa could not play his fiddle in the evenings because so many mosquitoes bit him. Mr. Edwards did not come visiting after supper anymore because the mosquitoes were so thick in the bottoms. All night Pet and Patty and the colt and the calf and the cow were stamping and swishing their tails in the stable. And in the morning Laura's forehead was speckled with mosquito bites. This won't last long, Pa said. Fall's not far away, and the first cold wind will settle 'em. Laura did not feel very well. One day she felt cold even in the hot sunshine, and she could not get warm by the fire. Ma asked why she and Mary did not go out to play, and Laura said she didn't feel like playing. She was tired and she ached. Ma stopped her work and asked, "Where do you ache?" Laura didn't exactly know. She just said, "I just ache. My legs ache." "I ache too," Mary said. Ma looked at them and said they looked healthy enough, but she said something must be wrong or they wouldn't be so quiet. She pulled up Laura's skirt and petticoats to see where her legs ached, and suddenly Laura shivered all over. She shivered so that her teeth rattled in her mouth. Ma put her hand against Laura's cheek. "You can't be cold," she said. "Your face is hot as fire." Laura felt like crying, but of course she didn't. Only little babies cried. "I'm hot now," she said, "and my back aches." Ma called Pa, and he came in. "Charles, do look at the girls," she said. "I do believe they are sick." "Well, I don't feel any too well myself," said Pa. "First I'm hot, and then I'm cold, and I ache all over." "Is that the way you feel, girls? Do your very bones ache?" Mary and Laura said that was the way they felt. Then Ma and Pa looked a long time at each other, and Ma said, "Well, the place for you girls is bed." It was so queer to be put to bed in the daytime. And Laura was so hot that everything seemed wavering. She held on to Ma's neck while Ma was undressing her, and she begged Ma to tell her what was wrong with her. "You will be all right. Don't worry," Ma said cheerfully. Laura crawled into bed, and Ma tucked her in. It felt good to be in bed. Ma smoothed her forehead with her cool, soft hand and said, "There now, go to sleep." Laura did not exactly go to sleep, but she didn't really wake up again for a long, long time. Strange things seemed to keep happening in a haze. She would see Pa crouching by the fire in the middle of the night. Then suddenly sunshine hurt her eyes, and Ma fed her broth from a spoon. Something dwindled slowly, smaller and smaller, till it was tinier than the tiniest thing. Then slowly it swelled till it was larger than anything could be. Two voices jabbered faster and faster. Then a slow voice drawled more slowly than Laura could bear. There were no words, only voices. Mary was hot in the bed beside her. Mary threw off the covers, and Laura cried because she was so cold. Then she was burning up, and Pa's hand shook the cup of water. Water spilled down her neck. The tin cup rattled against her teeth, though she could hardly drink. Then Ma tucked in the covers, and Ma's hand burned against Laura's cheek. She heard Pa say, "Go to bed, Caroline." Ma said, "You're sicker than I am, Charles." Laura opened her eyes and saw bright sunshine. Mary was sobbing, "I want a drink of water. I want a drink of water. I want a drink of water." Jack went back and forth between the big bed and the little bed. Laura saw Pa lying on the floor by the big bed. That's scary. Jack pawed at Pa and whined. He took hold of Pa's sleeves with his teeth and shook it. Pa's head lifted up a little, and he said, "I must get up. I must. Caroline and the girls." Then his head fell back and he lay still. Jack lifted his nose and howled. Laura tried to get up, but she was too tired. Then she saw Ma's red face looking over the edge of the bed. Mary was all the time crying for water. Ma looked at Mary, and then she looked at Laura, and she whispered, "Laura, can you?" "Yes, Ma," Laura said. This time she got out of bed. But when she tried to stand up, the floor rocked and she fell down. Jack's tongue lapped and lapped at her face, and he quivered and whined. But he stood still and firm when she took hold of him and sat up against him. She knew she must get water to stop Mary's crying, and she did. She crawled all the way across the floor to the water bucket. There was only a little water in it. She shook with so much cold that she could hardly get hold of the dipper. But she did get hold of it. She dipped up some water, and she set out to cross that enormous floor again. Jack stayed beside her all the way. Mary's eyes didn't open. Her hands held on to the dipper, and her mouth swallowed all the water out of it. Then she stopped crying. The dipper fell on the floor, and Laura crawled under the covers. It was a long time before she began to get warm again. Sometimes she heard Jack sobbing. Sometimes he howled, and she thought he was a wolf, but she was not afraid. She lay burning up and hearing him howl. She heard voices jabbering again, and the slow voice drawling, and she opened her eyes and saw a big black face close above her face. It was coal black and shiny. Its eyes were black and soft. Its teeth shone white in a thick, big mouth. This voice smiled, and a deep voice said softly, "Drink this, little girl." An arm lifted under her shoulders, and a black hand held a cup to her mouth. Laura swallowed a bitter swallow and tried to turn her head away. But the cup followed her mouth. The mellow, deep voice said again, "Drink it, it will make you well." So Laura swallowed the whole bitter dose. When she woke up, a fat woman was stirring the fire. Laura looked at her carefully, and she was not black, she was tan, like Ma. "I want a drink of water, please," Laura said. The fat woman brought it at once. The good cold water made Laura feel better. She looked at Mary asleep beside her. She looked at Ma and Pa asleep in the big bed. Jack lay half asleep on the floor. Laura looked again at the fat woman and asked, "Who are you?" "I'm Mrs. Scott," the woman said, smiling. "There now, you feel better, don't you?" "Oh, yes, thank you," Laura said politely. The fat woman brought her a cup of hot prairie chicken broth. "Drink it all up like a good child," she said. Laura drank every drop of that good broth. "Now, go back to sleep," said Mrs. Scott. "I'm here to take care of everything till you're all well." Next morning, Laura felt so much better that she wanted to get up. But Mrs. Scott said she must stay in bed until the doctor came. She lay and watched Mrs. Scott tidy the house and give medicine to Pa and Ma and Mary. Then it was Laura's turn. She opened her mouth, and Mrs. Scott poured a dreadful bitterness out of a small folded paper onto Laura's tongue. Laura drank water and swallowed and drank again. She could swallow the powder, but she couldn't swallow the bitterness. Then the doctor came, and he was the black man. Laura had never seen a black man before, and she could not take her eyes off Dr. Tan. He was so very black. She would have been afraid of him if she had not liked him so much. He smiled at her with all his white teeth. He talked with Pa and Ma and laughed a rolling, jolly laugh. They all wanted him to stay longer, but he had to hurry away. Mrs. Scott said that all the settlers up and down the creek had fever and ague. There were not enough well people to take care of the sick, and she had been going from house to house working night and day. "Oh, it's a wonder you ever lived through," she said, "all of you down at once." What might have happened if Dr. Tan hadn't found them, she didn't know. Dr. Tan was a doctor with the Indians. He was on his way north to Independence when he came to Pa's house. It was a strange thing that Jack, who hated strangers, and never let anyone come near the house until Pa or Ma told him to, had gone to meet Dr. Tan and begged him to come in, so Jack saved them. "And here you all were, more dead than alive," Mrs. Scott said. Dr. Tan had stayed with them a day and a night before Mrs. Scott came. Now he was doctoring all the sick settlers. Mrs. Scott said that all this sickness came from eating watermelons. Yeah, she said, "I've said 100 times, and if I have once, that watermelons—" "What's that?" Pa exclaimed. Who's got watermelons?" Mrs. Scott said that one of the settlers had planted watermelons in the creek bottoms, and every soul who had eaten one of those watermelons was down sick with that very minute. She said she had warned them, but no, she said, there was no arguing with them. They would eat those melons, and now they're paying for it. "Why, I haven't tasted a good slice of watermelon since Hector was a pup," said Pa. The next day he was out of bed, and the next day Laura was up. Then Ma got up, and then Mary. They were all thin and shaky, but they could take care of themselves, so Mrs. Scott went home. Ma said she didn't know how they could ever thank her, and Mrs. Scott said, "Oh, psh, What are neighbors for but to help each other out? Pa's cheeks were hollows, and he walked slowly. Ma often sat down to rest. Laura and Mary didn't feel like playing. Every morning they all took those bitter powders. But Ma still smiled her lovely smile, and Pa whistled cheerfully. It's an ill wind that doesn't blow some good, he said. He wasn't able to work, so he could make a rocking chair for Ma. He brought some slender willows from the creek bottoms, and he made the chair in the house. He could stop any time to put wood on the fire or lift a kettle for Ma. First, he made 4 stout legs and braced them firmly with cross pieces. Then he cut thin strips of tough willow skin just under the bark. He wove those strips back and forth under and over till they made a seat for the chair. He split a long, straight sapling down the middle. He pegged one end of half of it to the side of the seat and curved it up and over and down and pegged the other end to the other side of the seat. That made a high, curved back to the chair. He braced it firmly, and then he wove the thin willow strips across and up and down, under and over each other till they filled in the chair back. With the other half of the split sapling, Pa made arms for the chair. He curved them from the front of the seat to the chair back, and he filled them in with woven strips. Last of all, he split a larger willow which had grown in a curve. He turned that chair upside down, and he pegged the curved pieces to the legs to make the rockers. And the chair was done. Then they made a celebration. Ma took off her apron and smoothed her smooth brown hair. She pinned her gold pin on the front of her collar. Mary tied the string of beads around Carrie's neck. Pa and Laura put Mary's pillow on the chair seat, and set Laura's pillow against its back. Over the pillows, Pa spread the quilt from the little bed. Then he took Ma's hand and led her to the chair, and he put baby Carrie in her arms. Ma leaned back into the softness. Her thin cheeks flushed, and her eyes sparkled with tears, but her smile was beautiful. The chair rocked her gently, and she said, "Oh, Charles, I haven't been so comfortable since I don't know when." Then Pa took the fiddle, and he played and sang to Ma in the firelight. Ma rocked, and baby Carrie went to sleep, and Mary and Laura sat on the bench and were happy. The very next day, without saying where he was going, Pa rode away on Patty. Ma wondered and wondered where he had gone, and when Pa came back, he was balancing a watermelon in front of him on the saddle. He could hardly carry it into the house. He let it fall on the floor and dropped down beside it. "I thought I'd never get it here," he said. "It must weigh 40 pounds, and I'm as weak as water. Hand me the butcher knife." "But Charles," Ma said, "you mustn't." Mrs. Scott said. Pa laughed his big, pealing laugh again. "But that's not reasonable," he said. "This is a good melon. Why should it have fever and ague? Everyone knows that fever and ague comes from breathing the night air." "Well, that watermelon grew in the night air," said Mom. "Nonsense," Pa said. "Give me the butcher knife. I'd eat this melon if I knew it would give me chills and fever." "Well, I do believe you would," said Ma, handing him the knife. It went into the melon with a luscious sound. The green rind split open, and there was the bright red inside, flecked with black seeds. The red heart actually looked frosty. Nothing had ever been so tempting as that watermelon on that hot day. Ma would not taste it. She would not let Laura and Mary eat one bite. But Pa ate slice after slice after slice until at last he sighed and said the cow would have to eat the rest. Next day, he had a little chill and a little fever. Ma blamed the watermelon, but the next day she had a chill and a little fever. So they did not know what could have caused their fever and ague. No one knew in those days that fever and ague was malaria, and that some mosquitoes give it to people when they bite them, as we had talked about before. So, some interesting things. This chapter definitely sets our setting as as to when it happened. Um, in this chapter, we know in this book we know that Ma, Pa, Mary, Laura, and Baby Carrie were real people, um, because she wrote about them, and we can look up her and her family on the internet. The other people, Mr. Edwards, or Mr. and Mrs. Scott, you aren't going to find any historical information about them recorded, but this Dr. Tan, who is in this chapter, is a very, very famous Indian doctor. One of the first African American men to get a degree in being a doctor from a school in the South back east. He wasn't able to practice because most of the white people, it was a bad time. Most of the white people wouldn't go to a black doctor. So he headed out west and he became a doctor to the Indians. So he is somebody you can look up. If you Google him, you'll find out all kinds of information about his life, where he went to school, where he traveled, and you can see that he was a real live person and exactly when he lived and died. So that helps us understand that this is an autobiography about real people because there are historical figures in it as well. Now, our word we were looking for was quinine, which is that bitter powder that they had to eat, or try to get down, which was obviously a medicine. And it is a medicine that treats malaria and also yellow fever and some other things. Um, and sometimes you hear the word quinine, and sometimes today you hear the word chloroquine, which is a pill form of quinine. Um, and I said you may have already heard that word because they have both been used recently in some trials here in the United States and in other places around the world as a possible medicine for treating the coronavirus. So there hasn't been much talked about them lately. I don't know how far they've gone in testing it to see if it is a good treatment or not. But it's been around a long time, and it's a medicine that treats a very serious illness, which I have to say, in rereading this chapter with you right now, some of the symptoms seem to be kind of similar, at least the fever part of it. And they had extremely high fevers in this chapter, didn't they? So malaria came from mosquitoes, not from watermelons, which we eat watermelons all the time. It didn't come from breathing night air down by the water. It didn't come from anything like that. It came from obviously germs, which they didn't understand a lot about at the time, and in particular from germs that were found in certain kinds of mosquitoes. Today in our world, there is no malaria in the United States anymore. They have eradicated or wiped out all of the disease-bearing mosquitoes that were in the United States that carried malaria. Now, if you travel to other parts of the world, as I said in an earlier reading, you have to get special shots because they do have those kind of mosquitoes there. And then you have to take that quinine while you're there, and then when you come home for a certain amount of time, quinine or chloroquine, to make sure that you don't get it, or if you do get it, it's very mild. So we'll see if we hear any more about that. And then we're going to read our second chapter, Fire in the Chimney, which looks very, very scary. The prairie had changed. Now it was a dark yellow, almost brown, and the red streaks of sumac lay across it. So we're definitely into September. The wind wailed in the tan grass, and it whispered sadly across this curly, short buffalo grass. At night the wind sounded like someone crying. Pa said again that this was a great country. In the big woods he had had to cut hay and cure it and stack it and put it in the barn for winter. Here on the high prairie the sun had cured the wild grass where it stood, and all winter the mustangs and the cow could mow their own hay. He needed only a small stack for stormy days. Now the weather was cooler and he could go to town. He had not gone while the summer was hot because the heat would be too hard on Pet and Patty. They must pull the wagon 20 miles a day to get to town in 2 days. So it's 40 miles to the north. And he did not want to be away from home any longer than he had to. So it took 2 days to get there, and however much time to do your business, usually a day, and then 2 days to get back. So Paul would be gone for a whole week. So you can see why they didn't go away from the house very often. It's like they were always in quarantine, wasn't it? But it was a different world. He stacked the small stack of hay by the barn. He cut the winter's wood and corded it in a long cord against the house. Now he had only to get meat enough to last while he was gone, so he took his gun and went hunting. Laura and Mary played in the wind outdoors. When they heard a shot echo in the woods along the creek, they knew that Pa had got some meat. The wind was cooler now, and all along the creek bottoms flocks of wild ducks were rising, flying, settling again. Up from the creek came long lines of wild geese forming in V's for their flight farther south. The leader in front called to those behind him. "Honk!" he called, and all down the lines the wild geese answered, one after another. "Honk, honk, honk!" Then he cried, "Honk!" and "Honk, honk, honk, honk!" The others answered him. Straight away south he flew on his strong wings, and the long lines evenly followed him. The tree tops along the creek were colored now. Oaks were reds and yellows and browns and greens. Cottonwoods and sycamores and walnuts were sunshiny yellow. The sky was so brightly blue and the wind was rough. That afternoon the wind blew fiercely and it was cold. Ma called Laura and Mary into the house. She built up the fire and drew her rocker near it, and she sat rocking baby Carrie and singing softly to her. "Buy low bunting, Papa's gone a hunting, to get a rabbit skin to wrap the baby bunting in." Laura heard a crackling in the chimney. Ma stopped singing. She bent forward and looked up the chimney. Then she got up quietly, put Carrie in Mary's arms, pushed Mary down into the rocking chair, and hurried outdoors. Laura ran after her. The whole top of the chimney was on fire. Remember, they did that stick and daub with green sticks and clay, which was generally okay, but sometimes when there was a lot of drying wind, which there had been on the prairie, it would dry out and you could have a fire. The sticks that made it were burning up. The fire was roaring in the wind and licking towards the helpless roof. Ma seized a long pole and struck at the roaring fire, and burning sticks fell all around her. Laura didn't know what to do. She grabbed a pole too, but Ma told her to stay away. The roaring fire was terrible. It could burn the whole house, and Laura couldn't do anything. She ran into the house. Burning sticks and coals were falling down the chimney and rolling out on the hearth. The house was full of smoke. One big blazing stick rolled onto the floor under Mary's skirts. Mary couldn't move. She was so scared. Laura was too scared to think, so she grabbed the back of the heavy rocking chair and pulled with all her might. The chair with Mary and Carrie in it came sliding back across the floor. Laura grabbed up the burning stick and flung it into the fireplace just as Ma came in. "That's a good girl, Laura, to remember. I told you never to leave fire on the floor," Ma said. She took the water pail and quickly and quietly poured water on the fire in the fireplace. Clouds of steam came out. Then Ma said, "Did you burn your hands?" She looked at Laura's hands, but they were not burned because she had thrown the burning stick so quickly. Laura was not really crying. She was too big to cry. Only one tear ran out of each eye and her throat choked up, but that was not crying. She hid her face against Ma and hung on to her tight. She was so glad the fire had not hurt Ma. "Don't cry, Laura," Ma said, stroking her hair. "Were you afraid?" "Yes," Laura said. "I was afraid Mary and Carrie would burn up. I was afraid the house would burn up and we wouldn't have any house. I'm scared now." Mary could not talk. Or could talk now, I'm sorry. Mary could talk now. She told Ma how Laura had pulled the chair away from the fire. Laura was so little and the chair was so big and so heavy with Marion carrying in it that Ma was surprised. She said she didn't know how Laura had done it. You were a brave girl, Laura, she said. But Laura had really been terribly scared. Oh, and no harm's done, Ma said. The house didn't burn up. Mary's skirts didn't catch fire and burn her and Carrie, so everything is all right. When Pa came home, he found the fire out. The wind was roaring over the low stone top of the chimney, and the house was cold. But Pa said he would build up the chimney with green sticks and fresh clay and plaster it so well that it wouldn't catch fire again. He had brought 4 fat ducks, and he said he could have killed hundreds, but 4 was all they needed. He said to Ma, "You save the feathers from the ducks and geese we eat, and I'll shoot you a feather bed." He could, of course, have got a deer, but the weather was not yet cold enough to freeze the meat and keep it from spoiling before they could eat it. And he had found the place where a flock of wild turkeys roosted. "Our Thanksgiving and Christmas turkeys," he said. "Great big fat fellows. I'll get them when the time comes." Pa went whistling to mix mud and cut green sticks and build the chimney up again, while Ma cleaned the ducks. Then the fire merrily crackled, a fat duck roasted, and the cornbread baked. Everything was snug and cozy again. After supper, Pa said he supposed he'd better start to town early the next morning. "Might as well go and get it over with," he said. "Oh, yes, Charles, you'd better go," Ma said. "We could get along all right if I didn't," said Pa. "There is no need of running to town all the time for every little thing. I have smoked better tobacco than that stuff Scott raised back in Indiana, but it will do. I'll raise some next summer and pay him back. I wish I hadn't borrowed those nails from Edwards." "You did borrow them, Charles," Ma replied. "And as for the tobacco, you don't like borrowing any more than I do. But we need more quinine. And I've been sparing with the cornmeal, but it's almost gone, and so is the sugar. You could find a bee tree, but there's no cornmeal tree to be found, so far as I know. And we'll raise no corn until next year. A little salt pork would taste good, too, after all the wild game. And, Charles, I'd like to write to the folks in Wisconsin. If you mail a letter now, they can write this winter, and then we can hear from them next spring." "You're right, Caroline. You always are," Pa said. Then he turned to Mary and Laura and said it was bedtime. If he was going to start early in the morning, he'd better start sleeping early tonight. He pulled off his boots while Mary and Laura got into their nightgowns. But when they were in bed, he took down his fiddle. Softly he played and softly he sang. "So green grows the laurel, and so does the rue, so woeful my love at the parting with you." Ma turned toward him and smiled. "Take care of yourself on the trip, Charles, and don't worry about us," she told him. "We will be all right." Okay, so let's grab the board. And we know that quinine is medicine. And it is a very bitter tasting medicine. And people have long mixed the powder into different kinds of fluids to try to get rid of some of the awful tasting bitterness of it. But it is very effective. Okay, so now we're going to go to our trifle, and we have 2 boxes to fill in and then some questions to answer at the bottom. So in the first box, it says, when does this story take place? And we know that it takes place in the 1870s. In 1870s. Late 1870s, but 1870s. And then it says, where does the story take place? And we know that it is in Kansas. And then it was called Indian Territory. but today it would be the state of Kansas, and it is on the prairie. And then the last thing that we need to do is, how does the setting impact the plot? Could the story take place in the present day? So we know it affects the plot because it tells about life in pioneer days. So because it was set in the 1870s on the prairie in Kansas, it is telling us about a certain time in history. It's telling us about pioneer days. So if it were set in a different time period, it would have to tell us about different ways of people living. So then the next question says, could it take place today? And then tell why. So the answer to that question is obviously no, because life is lived differently today. We could live in the same place, and we could live in a house in the same place. We could be farmers in the same place, but it would not look the same. We wouldn't use a covered wagon. We would still be able to go to stores. We would travel much more quickly. We would buy more things. There would be the internet. So, no, it could not happen today because life is lived so differently today. All right, so that was a long session. Like I said, I wasn't sure why they put those two chapters together because they take a while to read, and they don't really go together, I don't think, but they're good chapters. So now, just take a picture of your finished trifold, and then you'll want to go on and do the activity for the close read as well.